So we're going to be doing a series over the coming weeks on why we are United Methodists, or really reasons that are really wonderful about being United Methodists. And so I thought I'd start this week by sharing how I became United Methodist. I don't know how much attention you all have paid to the tattoo on my arm. It got a lot of attention this week. You know, high schoolers are always intrigued when you have ink, so to speak. And so on my arm, if you can see it, is a cross and then the flame. And you all probably recognize the flame. The flame is from the United Methodist cross. And the cross itself is from the Presbyterian Church of the United States of America, PCUSA. And I was not raised Methodist. You know, I'm sure, having spent some time with you all, many of you were raised United Methodist. And that's, I think, a lovely thing. I actually didn't become a Methodist officially until I was 22 years old. So I've only been a Methodist for 10 years, which makes me, you know, maybe an adolescent Methodist. I was raised in the Presbyterian Church. I fell in love with Jesus in the Presbyterian Church. I got my call to ministry in the Presbyterian Church. I learned so many wonderful things about God's love and God's grace in the Presbyterian Church. And so even while I was attending a Methodist church in college, even while I was on leadership at a Methodist church in college, I was the Presbyterian in the group. I was the fly in the ointment, maybe, let's say. And so it was really surprising to my pastors back home when the model Presbyterian youth group member became a United Methodist pastor and went to United Methodist Seminary and went through United Methodist ordination. And what happened to me, and the reason my tattoo features both the Presbyterian cross and then the Methodist flame, was that while I learned so much about my faith, while I became a Christian through the Presbyterian Church, it was the Methodist view of grace that really awakened me to what it meant to be a follower of Jesus. Now, a brief disclaimer before we continue. This series is not a United Methodism is better than every other denomination series. I still have a lot of love for my siblings in Christ who are Baptist and Presbyterian and Catholic and Lutheran and non-denominational. I think that we all bring to the table at our best different focuses on who God is. But the series is meant to help us understand our place in this denomination and meant to help us reclaim some of the joy that I think is present in our denomination. And so today's scriptures are meant to help point us to what Wesley would have called the threefold form of grace. Because what I loved so much about Methodism, what made me decide that this was where I belonged, was that for Wesley, grace was not just a one-time moment of forgiveness. Grace was actually more than forgiveness. Grace is this ever-present working power throughout every part of our lives. And growing up Presbyterian, I was reminded constantly that God was the one who forgave me of my sins, and that is so very important. But that's missing a part, I think, of the fullness of the glory of grace that we read in today's scriptures. So I want to walk through this threefold form of grace for you and maybe even share some metaphors to help us hold on to this beautiful part of our heritage as Methodists. So for Wesley, there were three forms of grace. There is prevenient grace, prevenient meaning the grace that goes before. There is justifying grace, which is the one maybe we're most familiar with, the grace that justifies us, that forgives us, that cleans the slate before God. And then there was sanctifying grace, which is called the grace that perfects. And perfection is a difficult term, but we'll get to that. When I talk about prevenient grace, I think about this Psalm 139 and this idea that God is not just kind of dropping off us in the world, but that God forms us intentionally, that God is very much involved in our life, even before we're mindful of it. I've had one pastor describe it this way, and I think this is the most beautiful analogy I've heard for prevenient grace. many of us here on this call, we're our parents, and we're parents of babies and young children. Some that was not too long ago. For others, maybe a little longer ago. I have not had the pleasure of doing that, but I remember when my niece was born, I was in my teenage years, and so my sister would often let me help her out with my niece. And in the beginning, you have this bottle full of nutrients that a baby needs, and it's your job as the caretaker to make sure that that bottle gets in the mouth and that the baby drinks, those nutrients that they need to grow strong and to be healthy. And children don't always love to receive that bottle, that nutrients that they need. Sometimes they spit it out. Sometimes they don't take in the milk that's in it, or the formula that's in it. And that was the same with my niece, especially very young. She didn't know what that bottle meant. She just thought it was this invasive thing coming into her space. And so when she was very young, it was my job and my sister's job and my mom's job, just like it's any caretaker's job, to make sure that that bottle got into that baby's mouth and gave that baby the nutrients it needed, even when the baby fought, even when the baby punched the bottle away, even when the baby didn't even know what that bottle meant. And that is a good example of what prevenient grace is. That even when we have no clue who God is, that even when God feels like a distant or unknown thing, God is trying to reach out and give us the very thing we need to live, to be restored in relationship, to be strengthened. That God never gives up on us, but that God is always trying to give us grace, even when we don't know about it. It's not that God forces grace upon us violently, but that God does never stop trying to give us grace, like a good parent trying to ensure that their child is cared for. Moving on with that metaphor, eventually a child realizes, hey, this stuff's pretty good. I need this bottle. And the parent or the caretaker ensures that it's ready for them, and then they are able to grab it and then take it when they need it. And so for Wesley, we move from this moment of prevenient grace where God is kind of doing a lot of the work to ensure that we are receiving some sort of grace, to justifying grace, where we come to the knowledge of, I need this, I need God's forgiveness, and I need God's grace. And we move into this moment where faith, working through love, restores us in right relationship with God. We get to make a decision to return to have faith in this grace that's being given to us, and in that we get to restore our relationship with God, not by our power, but by God's power working through love, and by our faith in that. And so we come to justifying grace, that it is not us who forgive ourselves, but it is Christ's love working through faith that forgives us, that reminds us that, yes, I am a child of God and I am forgiven of sin. And so then we take the bottle for ourselves, the bottle that we didn't prepare, the food that we couldn't make, and we claim it as our own. And that's what Wesley viewed justifying grace as, that moment when we claim grace as something that is given to us. But what to me is the most beautiful thing about our Wesleyan faith, about being Methodists, is sanctifying grace. Now, Wesley actually thought about grace and sin almost as like infirmary and healing. He was almost like an Orthodox theologian in this way. Some of you know that the church that is currently worshiping in what used to be on Mount Carmel is an Ethiopian Orthodox church. And so their view of grace is similar in that grace is not just the gavel claiming that we're innocent. Grace is also the medicine that makes us strong again so we can be the body of Christ. It is healing the infirmity of our sin. And so Wesley moved past this justifying grace, past just being forgiven, to being perfected. That just like in 1 Peter says, we have been given this gift, this manifold of grace that has been bestowed upon us, and we are empowered to live lives that respond to that grace. Meaning that if we are truly recipients of God's grace, we get to live a little differently because we've received this grace. We get to be a little more loving. We get to be a little more hospitable. We get to push aside violence and hatred, and we get to live into something new, that we're not just, we are constantly being forgiven, but that forgiveness is constantly empowering us to live lives like Jesus. Now, I want to be clear. Methodists don't believe that we ever achieve perfection. They think that we can have moments where we are doing the will of God as perfectly as possible, but it's not us who are perfect. It is God's perfect love working through us. And I think that's just such a beautiful thing to think about. That grace is in any moment of your life working on you, whether you're as far from the church as you can be and God is just reaching out to you, or whether you are in the midst of a season of growth and you feel like you're ready to take on the world and God's grace is empowering you to be the love of Christ in the world, to make you more like Jesus and more closely aligned with Jesus' heart each day. That we as Methodists believe in a responsible grace. That God acts first and we get to respond in kind. And it was this version of grace that really awakened in me a new life of hope, a life that what we do here on this earth matters, not just about getting to be with God at the end, but that we can be a vision of God here and now, that we can show God's grace here and now, that God is always responding to us with grace. And I just love this imagery. This week, as I've said multiple times, I got to spend time with a lot of kids. And I saw so many different ways that grace had to show up in the midst of that. I said this pretty plainly, and maybe you all know or you remember, high schoolers can be pretty mean. They can say some of the nastiest things to each other. They can be at church camp and not be very church-like, or depending on your experience of church, very church-like, but maybe not as Christ-like as they should be. And the students were wonderful. But you started to hear these stories about what was going on in their own lives. And you started to realize that maybe some of the pain and the anger and the meanness that they were experiencing was just an offshoot from the own pain that was going on in their lives. And I had to be reminded this week, as I was trying to help share something good with them, that it wasn't my primary job to be an authoritarian disciplinarian, that it wasn't my job to just make them fall in line and do the right thing, but it was my job to respond to even the worst things they could say with grace. And what I love about our Methodist heritage, our Wesleyan tradition, is that grace is the central power, the central meaning, and the central calling of the church. That no matter what situation we may find ourselves in, God is shedding grace upon us, upon those that are surrounded by us. That if we are Methodist, we have to remember that God is always trying to share grace in whatever way is responsible and right in that moment. So when we have that friend who doesn't quite believe or know where they stand with God, that God is reaching out to them lovingly. When we have that person who has realized all the harm they have caused, that God is ready to forgive. And then when we have that friend or family member who knows about Jesus, who knows they're forgiven, that God is calling them to an even better and more loving life. There's real power in that version of grace. There's real joy in that version of grace, that there is not a moment where God is not working on you through love. And it was the beauty of that, the power of that, the calling of that called me out of what was a lovely church experience in the Presbyterian Church, but to become a United Methodist pastor. That I got to share grace with people in all circumstances and believe that grace was working, not just sitting there, but that grace was working. And I pray that we as United Methodists could live into that each day, to seek out how grace is working in our lives and in the lives of our neighbors, and that we too could respond to God's ever-present grace with grace of our own. Grace that mirrors that grace, that helps share it throughout the world. Would you all pray with me?